Military leaders from the West African nation of Niger have accused UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres of obstructing their participation in the body's General Assembly. Global leaders gathered in New York this week for the annual UN General Assembly. The Niger military claims Guterres is likely to undermine any effort to end the crisis in their country. Niger has come under sanctions and threats of military intervention from the Economic Community of West African States, called ECOWAS, following a military coup in July which ousted President Mohamed Bazoum. Bazoum's removal has been strongly criticized by Western governments and global bodies such as the United Nations.
Avec la complicité de la France et des deux chefs d'État francophones de la CEDEAO, le secrétaire général des Nations Unies s'est fourvoyé dans l'exercice de sa mission en faisant obstacle à la pleine participation du Niger aux travaux de la 78e session de l'Assemblée générale de l'ONU. La République du Niger recuse et dénonce avec force cette ingérence manifeste de M. Guterres dans les affaires intérieures d'un État souverain. Cette manœuvre de sape participe d'une logique de privatisation des relations diplomatiques consistant à un deal cynique et entre copains pour faire taire la voix de la vérité et du bon sens au détriment du Niger et de son peuple.
Let's speak to Development Economist and Frontline Group CEO Dr. Jason Musyoka about some of the key messages we heard from leaders on the African continent, at least. Dr. Jason Musyoka, during this meeting. Thank you very much for your time this morning. Perhaps let's reflect on the overall importance of these meetings. This is its 78th.
Yes, indeed. The 78th United Nations General Assembly, and they really get together every year. It's a system that was set up for global conversations around things that matter. Increasingly, it's become issues of security and climate change as the dominant themes of conversation. This particular one, the 78th, was really much more focused on climate issues. And, there is not a lot of satisfaction that there was any meaningful achievement as far as this was concerned. But yes, these are global conversations around things that matter and that are of a global scope.
Are global governance systems fit for the new multipolar world, Dr. Musyoka?
So, Dudu, it's a very interesting time. We live in a very interesting change of, world history. And one will again have to look at the historical development of the world order that there is now. You go back to the 20th century, in the early 1900s, and you had a multipolar world where there was Russia, of course there was China at the time, perhaps playing a minimal role, but there was Germany, there was the UK, and then, of course, there was the emerging US, which wasn't a superpower at the time. And historical evidence suggests that that kind of multipolar world, where you have different poles, so to speak, around the world in terms of power balancing, they delivered 2 world wars to the world. Then you moved to the Cold War period, and you had what is referred to as a bipolar world, which is where you have just 2 major superpowers. In this case, it was Russia and the US. And that went to the early 1990s, and the collapse of Russia then moved us to a unipolar world where there was one global superpower. We are back to where we were in the early 1900s, in a multipolar world where you're seeing Russia, you're seeing China, you're seeing BRICS as a bloc, the African Union, which has become much more vocal, and of course some sections of the European Union that are voicing sentiments of independence from the alliance with the US. So it really is a multipolar world which historians suggest that it's a dangerous system or world order because it really tends to create global conflicts, as I've just indicated, as far as the World War I and World War II are concerned.
So essentially we are regressing?
Yes, and I think that's one way of looking at it, and I think that Guterres, the UN Secretary General, made that remark as far as climate change is concerned. But I do think that one could look at either the regression, but there's also perhaps a way of looking at the fact that we've been here before, and the world really just goes around in cycles. If you look at models of history, that's really the way the world functions. The question for me perhaps is whether global institutions and the current global superpowers are able to rebuild institutions, because the failure of global institutions in the early 20th century was really the cause of the World War I and World War II. But if we go back to that period, and in the future we will come back again to a multipolar world, maybe after China rises, or this is now referred to as an Asian century, if you're going to have India and China as the superpowers, later on we'll come back to where we are. The key question is the extent to which we build global institutions fit for purpose to be able to deal with global questions such as global conflicts and so on. I don't think we've arrived at that point. I think we are still caught in between a pool of multilateralism, of which the U.S. is marshalling organizations but still wanting to take a lead, and a multipolar world. And I think we are somewhere in between. And the U.S. is really failing to recognize the rapid shift of history in this moment in time.
Let's take a look at what stood out for you in particular from leaders on the continent.
So I think, interestingly, very much as what was expected, there were vocal calls for Africa, Kenya, South Africa as well, Nigeria, making calls for the Northern Alliance or the Western world to make concessions as far as fossil fuels are concerned, to cut their carbon footprint. So those arguments were really forcefully made. I was particularly interested to hear South African President Ramaphosa really push back, and perhaps we've seen him much more vocal than previously. And he made arguments concerning the fact that most of the Western industrial powers, they calculate their wealth based on African resources. And I think that was a new boldness perhaps to see on a global level in the UN Assembly, certainly. So I think there were, again, calls, and it's a pushback, it's a moving the needle. I don't think there was anything radical that was not expected, but I think there was a pushback from African states that, this is an emerging Africa, and they want power balancing, power symmetry between the West and the rest of the world, particularly as far as climate change is concerned. There's also a pushback, Dudu, on the fact that the industrialized countries, they really developed on the back of fossil fuels. Now they are demanding that African countries and the rest of the world should cut their emissions. And the argument, the key issue now is whether developing countries are going to accept that proposition, of which they are not. Saudi Arabia and China, for example, walked out of discussions about cutting their carbon footprint. And this is really now the tension that is on a global level.
The Democratic Republic of Congo wants the withdrawal of MONUSCO to actually be moved to December 2023 instead of December 2024, arguing essentially that their presence in the country has not managed to turn the tide where insecurity is concerned.
DR Congo is a very complex country, and part of it really has to do with the colonial history and the colonial vestiges of the country itself. And the failure to, unfortunately, the region has also failed the DRC, not least the fact that the African Union has not been strong enough. The region itself, therefore, is really a volatile one. So one does not really see immediate solutions for DRC as far as security is concerned. But I also would like to point out the fact that DRC is a mineral economy. That is already problematic as far as political stability is concerned. And the reason being that when you have a country that is ungovernable, it's easier for capitalists to come in. And that is really the case with the DRC, because there is no government, and therefore there are no controls as far as capital inflow and outflow is concerned. That is a key trigger, and perhaps one would even perhaps raise the point that these kinds of expropriation of resources for DRC might sometimes, they really benefit out of these insecurities. And those are questions that I think need to be asked as far as DRC is concerned.
Not just DRC, Doc. It could very well argued that a number of countries on the continent. We take a look at the 64th UN General Assembly meeting back in 2009, and this is what Muammar Gaddafi of Libya said at the time. At present, and I read, the Security Council is security feudalism, political feudalism for those with permanent seats, protected by them and used against us. It should be called not the Security Council, but the Terror Council. In our political life, if they need to use the Security Council against us, they turn to the Security Council. If they have no need to use it against us, they ignore the Security Council. If they have an interest to promote, an axe to grind, they respect the glory and glorify the Charter of the United Nations. They turn to a particular chapter of the Charter and use it against the poor nations. If, however, they wish to violate the Charter, they would ignore it as if it did not exist at all. If the veto of the permanent members of the Security Council is given to those who have the power, this is injustice and terrorism and should not be tolerated by us. In 2023, you've got leaders from the African continent who are still beckoning for permanent representation, who are still beckoning for world systems to be corrected. What is it that, or how fit for purpose is it for leaders to petition the world? And when we take a look at bodies at home, when we take a look at what is set up on the African continent, what is it that we can do, right, to sort of address some of these very pressing issues that are felt by you and I?
So, very interesting point that you make. I think that the UN Secretary General made a point. It was very interesting for me. He made the point on the fact that we are really not moved forward. We haven't moved forward from the late 1940s when the Bretton Woods institutions were set up. The United Nations Security Council, the makeup has not really fundamentally changed. And the way the power balancing was set up. So this takes us back to the point we made earlier on multilateralism versus multipolar world. And I think, unfortunately, the UN Security Council, we know, in fact, Guterres was interviewed by Manpour, and he said, he was asked what he can do to try and change these issues, whether it's UN National Security Council, UN Security Council, or to change, the trade issues, conflict issues. And his key argument or proposition was that I have no power and I have no money. Because ultimately, the vanguards who make those decisions about who will go to the UN Security Council and not is really the same powers that they themselves do not want to give power to the United Nations itself. And that links back to this point of a world that thinks that, or a West that thinks that we are still living in a unipolar world where the U.S. is leading as a pole around the world and then marshalling everybody else around them. And I think that is a very mistaken calculation of where history is. And you have seen, for example, China has increased this year their military spending with 7.2%. They are spending now 7.2% of their GDP on military spending. That is huge, and that really talks to the fact that it's a pushback against what is really going on with the West refusing to cede power. So the rest of the world is suggesting let's go our way. Unfortunately for them, then you have an emerging pole, which is China and, of course, India. And the world is likely, the southern world perhaps, to begin to agglomerate around both China and India, in my assessment.
And that, too, comes with its own complications, but that's a conversation for another day. Thank you very much for your time this morning. Dr. Jason Musyoka is a development economist as well as Frontline Group CEO.